Carlos Mendoza left the harbor at midnight. No storm, no bad feeling. The Atlantic lay flat and undisturbed, a gentle swell, stars reflected in the water with almost no distortion, the diesel engine pulling steady and clean. His nephew Emilio sat on the stern with a thermos of coffee and said nothing. Good silence. Working silence. Carlos had run this route for 11 years. 40 miles northeast to the fishing grounds, 4 hours of work, back before sunrise. He never left word of where he was going or the route was familiar. There was no reason. His wife knew only that he left at night and came home in the morning. That had always been enough. About an hour out, the diesel hiccuped. Once, barely perceptible, a single stumble in the rhythm. Carlos pulled back the throttle and listened. Silence. The engine steadied and pulled forward again. Emilio looked up. It's nothing, Carlos said. Just a hiccup. They kept going. The diesel died at 3 in the morning. No warning. Just stopped. Carlos opened the engine cover and worked through it methodically. Fuel filter, injectors, fuel line. Flashlight between his teeth, hands in grease, Emilio holding a light from the side. 20 minutes in, the problem became clear. The fuel pump was failing. Without tools and spare parts on open water, that was the end of the engine. Carlos wiped his hands on a rag and picked up the radio. Pressed the button. Held it to his ear. White noise are flat, unbroken, no voices anywhere. He switched channels. Again. The antenna was secure. The power was on. It simply wasn't reaching. It happened on these waters sometimes when the atmosphere sat wrong. Usually cleared within an hour. An hour passed. Nothing changed. He set the radio down on the dash and looked around. No coastline. No lights in any direction. The current had been pushing the boat sideways for 3 hours without either of them noticing. He understood that now, checking the stars against the compass. They were not where he thought they were. How far off, he couldn't say. Emilio was standing at the rail, looking down at the water. Carlos, how much water do we have? Carlos checked. 2 liters in the jug, a thermos and a half of coffee, a couple of bottles in the storage box under the seat. Enough for 1 day if they were careful. 2 days if they were very careful. Enough, he said. That was the first lie. The sun came up on the 3rd day at 6 in the morning and immediately began to burn. They were drifting. Carlos had tried the engine again. The pump gave one short wheeze and went silent for good. Less than a quarter tank of fuel remained, but without the pump it made no difference. He tried rowing with the single paddle he found under the floorboards, working against the current that was pulling them southeast. He quit after an hour. Emilio was drinking water. Carlos watched him reach for the jug a second time before the morning had properly started and said nothing. He was young. He was scared. Thirst born from fear runs deeper than thirst from heat. Carlos knew this from an old experience he preferred not to revisit. He moved the jug closer to himself and began rationing it quietly, without explanation, measuring out portions without comment. That night they heard a ship. First a low rumble, distant and even, passing somewhere to the right. Then silence. Carlos worked the flashlight against the dark until the battery began to fade. The sound didn't return. Emilio wasn't sleeping. He sat on the stern and listened. They can't see us, he said finally. Not a question. Just a fact stated aloud. They will, Carlos answered. The second lie came easier than the first. On the 4th night, Emilio started seeing lights. First one a white, motionless, sitting right on the horizon. He jumped up and shouted, waving both arms. Carlos stood and looked. The horizon was black and empty in every direction. There, Emilio said, pointing. Right there. You see it. Carlos looked for a long time. Nothing. Sit down, he said quietly. But I can see. Sit down. Emilio lowered himself to the floor of the boat. A long silence. Then, without raising his head, I haven't been drinking enough. No, Carlos said. You haven't. By that point both their tongues had swollen. Speaking had become uncomfortable. Words came out slowly, as though pushing through something thick. Carlos had tightened the rationing to swallows morning and evening. It wasn't enough, but it stretched what they had. The skin on their shoulders and necks had blistered. Several had broken open. Carlos cut strips from his shirt on the 2nd day and wrapped the worst of it, but the sun didn't distinguish between covered and uncovered skin. By the morning of the 5th day, Emilio had nearly stopped talking. The container ship was running a course toward New Orleans at 6 in the morning on the 5th day. The officer on watch was standing on the bridge wing with binoculars, a routine sweep of the horizon, the kind he performed every half hour. Something flashed. Not a wave, not foam or metal, a short hard glint of the kind that only comes off a flat surface caught at a direct angle to the sun. He raised the binoculars. A small boat. Drifting. One man sitting motionless. Another lying on the floor. The captain ordered a course change. A lifeboat went down. Two sailors came alongside and called out. Carlos didn't understand at first that someone was speaking to him. The voices arrived as though filtered through water. He registered sound but couldn't separate the words. Then he saw the faces above the rail and understood they were real. Too specific, too present, pores on skin, fatigue in the eyes. Emilio was lifted off first. He was unconscious. They were not rescued because anyone was searching for them. They were rescued because a metal bracket on the stern caught the morning light at a precise angle at a precise moment when a man with binoculars happened to be looking in that direction. A second earlier or later and the ship would have passed without slowing. Emilio was discharged after a week. Carlos after 10 days. On shore there were family members, a reporter from the local paper, and a Coast Guard officer with an incident report. Carlos answered questions briefly and directly. The reporter asked what had been the hardest part. Carlos was quiet for a moment. Not the thirst, he said finally. Thirst is the body. The body endures. It was something else. On the 5th day I was lying on the floor of that boat thinking about my wife making coffee at home. My kids walking to school. Everything just continuing without us, without pausing. The world didn't notice we were gone. It just kept moving. The reporter wrote it down and left. The boat was towed to port. The engine was declared beyond repair. Carlos received the insurance settlement 3 months later and bought another vessel older, but fitted with a new diesel. Before his first trip out, he left a note on the refrigerator. The route, departure time, expected return, call sign. His wife asked why he'd never done that before, had always just gone. I'm doing it now, he said. He didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Second story. The yacht went under in 4 minutes. Not gradually all at once, without warning, the way the ocean makes a decision and stops taking questions. One moment Sarah Harlan was at the helm shouting at her husband to dog down the forward hatch. And the next she was hanging off the lifeline while a wave the height of a 2-story house swept the deck clean of everything that wasn't bolted down. Daniel went over the side. She watched the mast fall as slowly, almost ceremonially, and heard something crack. Not wood. Not rigging. Something alive. Then darkness. Cold water. She came up on her own, with no memory of how. The life raft deployed automatically orange, improbable, roughly the size of a kitchen table. Sarah hauled Daniel aboard. He was conscious. The left side of his face was sheeted in blood. A splinter from the shattered mast had torn across his cheekbone and down his shoulder, splitting his jacket to the skin beneath. The Atlantic off the Florida coast in November is not forgiving. The water runs in the low 40s, and the wind comes off the open ocean like something with a grudge. The yacht was gone. No shore lights anywhere. Daniel lay back and closed his eyes. Don't, Sarah said. Her voice came out hard and unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone else. She was not a medic. Sarah designed interiors for a living, made a decent pad thai, and had only recently stopped white-knuckling parallel parking. She had no medical training of any kind. But she pulled off her fleece, tore it into strips, and bound Daniel's shoulder so tightly that he groaned and tried to push her hands away. That hurts. I know. The shoulder wound slowed. What worried her more was his breathing uneven, with gaps and the shaking that moved through him from somewhere deep and wouldn't quit. Hypothermia sets in fast in November water. There was no time to ease into anything. Sarah pressed herself against his right side and started talking. She told him about their first trip to New Orleans, 5 years back. How he got turned around in the French Quarter, and they spent 2 hours covering the same streets because he refused to open the map app. How they made a bet over dinner, and she won, and for the next 3 years he found ways to mention, at every possible opportunity, that the restaurant had been overrated. Daniel listened. He winced into something close to a smile now and then. He kept his eyes open. Something bumped the underside of the raft once, then again. Large. She said nothing about it. Around 2 in the morning he asked her to stop. Sarah, let me sleep. 20 minutes. No, I'm exhausted. I need to. No, she said again, and the softness was gone entirely. You don't sleep until I say so. You hear me? He went quiet. Then, low and flat, he said she always did this and made the decisions, ran the show, never stopped to ask. In another life she would have answered that. She would have pulled the whole thread and followed it all the way back. Instead she said, "Tell me about that boat you were looking at down in Miami." The sailboat. Silence. Then he started talking. 32 feet, cutter-rigged sloop, built in the early 80s but well-maintained. He described it the way some men describe something they've already decided to love, every detail, every flaw he planned to correct. Sarah listened without interrupting. She didn't care about the boat. She cared about one thing only. He was talking. Sometime around 1 in the morning, lights appeared on the horizon. She waved out just her hand, and the dark and the lights moved on without changing course. She lowered her arm and said nothing. Daniel was mid-sentence about the engine. She didn't stop him. Around 4 in the morning, she lied to him for the first time. "Dan, there are lights out there. Looks like shore." He turned his head. The horizon was empty and black in every direction. "Where?" "Just off to the left. You see them?" "No, they're there. We're drifting toward land." Another hour, maybe 2. He was quiet for a long time. Then, "You're lying." She didn't answer. "Sarah, you're lying to me." "Yes," she said finally. Flat, unapologetic. "I am. And I'll do it again if I have to. So talk to me about the boat." Daniel closed his eyes. She gripped his hand immediately. "Don't. I'm not sleeping. I'm thinking. Think out loud." A third of a water bottle remained. She divided it into 2 swallows for him and 1 for herself, though her own tongue had been sticking to the roof of her mouth for hours. He didn't notice the split. She made sure of that. At some point she understood that she herself was barely holding on. Not from thirst or from a kind of exhaustion that sleep couldn't touch. She stared at the dark water, and the thought moved through her. What if she just let go? Just for a moment. Just let the silence take all of it. Then Daniel shifted and said her name quietly, in the dark. And she answered. The gray came up so gradually she almost missed it to one shade of darkness becoming another, and then the horizon was visible, and the night was over. Daniel was breathing. Shallow, labored, but steady. His forehead was warm in a way it shouldn't have been, and that frightened her more than the wound. Infection, open water, no medication, no help on the way. Sarah hadn't moved in hours. Her legs had gone past numb into something without a name. Her back ached in a way she'd long since stopped tracking. She pushed both things to the edges of her attention and did the only thing left to do. Swept the horizon in slow, deliberate arcs, sector by sector, refusing to let her eyes drift. A tour boat appeared just after 7 in the morning. It came from the north, white with a blue stripe, running at a steady clip. Sarah stood up, the raft lurched, Daniel grabbed the side, and she yelled and waved with the kind of full-body desperation that feels, in the moment, like it might actually make a physical difference. They saw her. The boat came around and slowed 10 minutes later. Getting them aboard required lifting them by hand. Daniel spent 11 days in a hospital in Miami. Surgery on the shoulder, IV antibiotics, fluids. The scar on his cheekbone stayed thin, almost neat, like a line drawn with a fingernail. Sarah was discharged after 3 days. She came back every morning and sat in the chair by the window while he slept. Sometimes she read. Sometimes she just sat. On the 11th day, as he was being moved to a regular room, a reporter from the local paper asked for a comment. Daniel kept it brief. "I survived because she wouldn't let me go quiet." The reporter wrote it down and left. Sarah was standing in the doorway and heard every word. She said nothing. She took his hand and walked with him down the hall. They never rebuilt the yacht. The insurance settlement came through, and they bought a boat out of Miami, 32 feet, cutter-rigged sloop, built in the early 80s. A few things needed work, which Daniel had already planned for. Sarah went out on the water with him for the first time in March. No argument. No explanation. Sometimes there's nothing left to explain. Sometimes it's enough to have refused to let someone go silent. Third story. The fuel gauge read 3/4 when Ryan Kessler cleared the Moorhead City Marina at 6 in the morning. He'd plotted the route the night before, 45 nautical miles out to the fishing grounds off Cape Lookout, 3 hours of running, a few hours on the water, back before dark. Ryan had been going out alone for 17 years. No crew, no unnecessary radio chatter, just the boat, the engine, and open water. He considered this normal. People who couldn't understand the point of solo runs had simply never tried one. The morning was easy. The Atlantic off the North Carolina coast in September can be almost drowsy. A gentle swell, a southwest breeze, 12 miles of visibility in every direction. Ryan set his course on the GPS, pushed up the throttle, and settled back in his seat. At 8:45, the chart plotter flickered and went dark. Not a freeze, not a reboot, it simply died, all at once and without warning. Ryan pressed the power button. Nothing. Held it down. The screen stayed black. He lifted the cover on the battery compartment and found what he'd been half expecting. Corrosion on the terminals, salt worked in over a full season. He'd meant to replace the unit before winter. He hadn't gotten around to it. He raised his head. The horizon looked exactly the same in every direction. The fog arrived before he could get a sun bearing. First a thin haze that softened the horizon. 20 minutes later visibility had dropped to about 50 yards, and the ocean had shrunk to a gray circle around the hull. Ryan pulled back to steerage speed and navigated by compass, an old mechanical unit bolted to the dash by the boat's previous owner. The needle trembled but held. He chose west toward the coast, by his reckoning, and held that heading for an hour and a half. When the fog began to lift, Ryan saw land. The wrong land. A low strip of shore stretched off to his left, a flat, choked with marsh grass, no structures, no lights. The Barrier Islands. The current had pushed him considerably farther south than his intended course, and he was now somewhere between Cape Lookout and Cape Fear, in the shallow Sound country, where you don't take a motorboat without a detailed chart. Ryan cut the engine and checked the fuel. The needle sat just below a quarter tank. He stayed with that for a moment, not panicking, just calculating. A quarter tank was roughly 25 miles at a conservative cruising speed, less if you worked the engine hard. Morehead City was somewhere around 35 miles north, by a direct route he couldn't plot. The nearest settlement on the Barrier Islands, unknown. He had enough fuel for one direction. And he needed to choose it now. Ryan made his first decision quickly. It was the wrong one. 2 miles to the northeast, he spotted the running lights of a commercial trawler, a large vessel that clearly knew these waters. He started the engine and ran toward it at full throttle, bow up, the hull hammering across the chop. He burned 20 minutes and nearly a gallon before the conclusion became unavoidable. The trawler was making better speed, and the distance between them wasn't closing. It was growing. He pulled back the throttle. The bow dropped, and the boat rolled in the trawler's wake. The fuel needle dropped another notch. He pulled out the signal flares, 3 of them in a waterproof case. Held one without firing it. The trawler was still visible, still moving away. Fire now, and there was a chance someone would see it. But if no one did, one flare was gone, and 2 remained. Ryan put it back in the case. He ran west at low speed along the edge of the shallows and anchored to 100 yards off the marsh. Any closer, and he risked the grass and the soft bottom. From shore came only wind. A paper chart turned up under the floorboards, worn, small scale, inadequate for this stretch of coast. Ryan circled his estimated position in pencil. The circle of uncertainty covered roughly 20 miles of shoreline. He decided to wait out the night at anchor. The reasoning was straightforward. Running after dark through unfamiliar shoal water on a near-empty tank meant stranding the boat for certain. Come morning, the birds would show him which way the coast lay. Fishing boats would be out early. He'd be able to see where he was going. The night ran longer than he'd planned. After midnight the wind picked up, not a storm, but a sustained chop that worked the boat steadily and without pause. Ryan sat on the stern seat, life jacket pulled over his jacket, and fought the pull of sleep. He held on for 3 hours, counting seconds, slapping himself across the face when his eyes went soft, singing half-remembered songs from years back under his breath. At some point his head dropped to his chest. He woke to an impact. The boat had swung hard on the anchor rode and taken a wave broadside. Ryan grabbed the gunwale and straightened up fast. The darkness around him was total. Whether he'd been out for 5 minutes or 20, he had no way of knowing. The anchor held. He got to his feet and stayed there until first light. Just stood, both hands on the bimini frame, and refused to sit down. At dawn he saw birds. A large flock of gulls tracking in from the southwest, low over the water, moving in one consistent direction. He watched them for a long time. Gulls fly toward shore to feed toward shore, or toward fishing boats. He started the engine. He followed the birds for 40 minutes at the lowest throttle setting. The engine would hold at barely above idle, the hull sluggish and slow to respond in the swell. The fuel gauge needle lay flat against the peg. Ryan stopped looking at it. His thinking had slowed. Thoughts arrived with a delay, as though pushing through something dense. He caught himself staring at the water with nothing in his head, just staring, and it went on longer than it should have. He shook himself and fixed his eyes on the horizon. The shore appeared without warning, and not gradually, the way land usually builds out of the water, but all at once, as though someone had moved the scenery. A dock. Buildings. Flags on poles. For a moment Ryan wasn't certain it was real. The engine quit 300 yards from the harbor entrance. No coughing, no warning, it simply stopped. The fuel was gone. The bow began to swing sideways into the swell. Ryan grabbed the paddle and started working a full body. No pauses, not thinking about his arms. The chop came in on his beam, and the paddle barely held a line. About 6 feet from the dock, a wave pushed him into the pilings. He threw the bow line and missed. The loop dropped into the water. He pulled it back, threw again. It caught. Ryan hauled the boat in hand over hand. It came alongside and bumped the dock. He got the stern line on and sat there for several minutes, both hands wrapped around a wooden piling, not moving. Then he looked up. An older man in an orange safety vest was standing on the dock, watching him without any particular surprise. "Long way around," the man said. "Came out of Morehead City," Ryan said. The man nodded slowly. "Took the scenic route." Ryan Kessler had made landfall at Ocracoke, an island with no road bridge, cut off from the mainland and reachable only by ferry. He bought 5 gallons of fuel in a can from a shop near the waterfront. He drank 2 mugs of coffee and ate a sandwich at a diner down the block, and he sat at the window table for the better part of an hour before he trusted his legs enough to stand. The trip back took 4.5 hours. He ran by compass and coastline, keeping land in sight the whole way. He came into Morehead City at 3 in the afternoon. Nobody was waiting at the dock. He hadn't told anyone he was going out. The route was familiar. There'd been no reason to mention it. At home, the first thing he did was replace the chart plotter battery. Then he opened a notepad and wrote out a list. Working GPS, paper chart of the correct scale, full tank at departure, spare fuel jug aboard, 3 signal flares, charged phone in a waterproof bag, a message left for someone with the route and expected return time. The list filled half a page. He read it over, put the notepad away, and went to bed. All 3 flares were still untouched in their case. He'd held them back, saved them for when things got truly desperate, and in the end hadn't used a single one. Whether that had been sound judgment or just luck, he genuinely couldn't say. Maybe keeping them in reserve was what had prevented the situation from becoming unrecoverable. Or maybe it was simply the birds. The difference between those 2 explanations was impossible for him to establish. And that, more than anything else about the whole ordeal, was what stayed with him. 4th story. Lisa Morales lay in the cabin and listened to her parents laughing on deck. A quiet laugh, her father saying something low, her mother answering, and in that sound was everything familiar and solid, the whole ordered world of her 11 years. The Caribbean rocked the yacht slowly, almost like a lullaby. Moonlight fell through the porthole onto the cabin floor. Then came the screaming. She didn't understand at first that it was screaming, or the shift was too abrupt, too incompatible with what had existed a moment before. Then gunshots. 2 or 3, she didn't count. Heavy footsteps hammered across the deck above her head, and she rolled off the bunk and pressed herself against the wall beneath it before she had consciously decided to move. She heard everything. A man's voice, unfamiliar, clipped, issuing short commands. Then a sound she spent years afterward unable to name. A dull impact and a splash beyond the hull. Then again. Then a silence that was worse than any sound. The footsteps came below. The cabin door opened. Captain Velasco stood in the doorway looking at her. His face was calm, almost tired. He was in no hurry. Lisa was dragged up to the deck and thrown into the water. A small inflatable life raft, emergency orange, barely large enough to lie down on, hit the surface beside her. She reached it on her own, though she couldn't have explained how. The yacht moved away. The lights at the stern grew smaller. Then they were gone. Around her there was only black water and the night. She didn't cry. That seemed strange to her even then, in the dark, gripping the side of the raft with wet hands. The tears didn't come. Instead, there was a stillness, a very quiet, very cold, and inside that stillness she moved. She found a length of cord attached to the side of the raft and tied it around her waist, pulled herself up and lay on her stomach, rolled onto her back. The night sky above her was vast and full of stars. She said the names aloud: Mama, Papa, Carlos. Not a shout, just a statement, as though they might respond. No one responded. She said them again, more quietly. Then she stopped. By dawn, the water around the raft had turned gold. The sun came up fast and immediately began to burn her face, her hands, her legs. Lisa lay still and closed her eyes. To move was to use water she didn't have. She understood this without being told, as though someone had prepared her for it in advance. At night she collected dew from the surface of the raft with her tongue, slowly, drop by drop. It was not enough, but it was something. Fish brushed against her legs when she let them hang over the side. She wasn't afraid of them. There was nothing left to be afraid with. On the third day she caught her first fish. She lay still at the edge of the raft, her arm submerged to the shoulder, and waited. The fish came on its own, a small, silver. Her fingers closed before she had thought to close them. She ate it raw, slowly, not thinking about the taste. Rain came on the fourth day, brief, but real. She lay on her back and opened her mouth. Then she folded the corner of her shirt into a funnel and collected what she could in her cupped hands. It was the best water she had ever tasted. At night, the ocean glowed. Phosphorescence lit the waves, a cold blue light that reached into the depths and faded. Lisa watched it and talked. She described the house in Miami, how Carlos had taught her to play cards and cheated every time, the smell of her mother's hair after a shower of coconut shampoo. She remembered exactly. Her voice was quiet and steady, and the ocean answered only with the rhythm of its waves, even and constant as breathing. There was something in that one-sided conversation that held her. Not hope, but she wouldn't allow herself to think about hope. Just presence. The sense that she existed as long as she kept speaking. On the fifth day the heat became unbearable. The skin on her shoulders and forehead had blistered, split open, and turned to raw wounds that the salt water stung with every passing wave. Lisa lay on her back and looked at the sky. Clouds moved slowly overhead, large and white, shaped like tall ships under full sail. At some point she thought about Captain Velasco. Not with anger, the anger had left her earlier. She hadn't noticed when. She simply thought of him as a fact. A man who had done what he did and sailed away into the dark. She didn't forgive him in any formal or ceremonial sense. She simply stopped spending on him what little she had left. Then she began to sing. A lullaby her mother had sung to her when she was small, simple, in Spanish, about the moon over a river and fishermen coming home. Her voice shook. The words sometimes blurred together. She started over from the beginning, and again, until the words steadied and the shaking left her voice. She sang for hours, or perhaps minutes. By then time had lost its shape. On the sixth day she barely moved. Her arms lay at her sides. Breathing took less effort than shifting her weight. She watched the light change, and the clouds rearrange themselves into new formations, and she thought about nothing in particular. The silhouette appeared on the horizon in the middle of the afternoon. At first she took it for another cloud. But it didn't change shape or dissolve, it grew slowly, took on edges, and after a while she could make out a superstructure and a thin trail of smoke above it. Lisa pushed herself up onto her elbows. The vessel wasn't heading directly toward her, it was tracking slightly to the right, off to one side. She looked at her hands, burned, cracked, and began to wave. Slowly at first, then faster. On the bridge of a Greek cargo ship working a southbound Atlantic route, the officer on watch raised his binoculars at a flash of orange 3 miles off the port bow. A small raft. A child on it. He stood there for a moment before he called the bridge, because what he was seeing didn't seem possible. Lisa was brought aboard on the 6th day. She weighed less than an 11-year-old girl should weigh. Burns, dehydration, exhaustion. Doctors at a Miami hospital kept her for 12 days. She survived without lasting physical damage. The medical staff called it extraordinary luck. Journalists called it a miracle. The story spread around the world within days. Captain Velasco was located 3 weeks later in a port on the Colombian coast. He received a life sentence. Lisa grew up. She finished college, married, had 2 children. She gave interviews rarely and never disclosed the full account of that week on the water. In the conversations she did allow, she returned to one detail. A light she had seen beneath the surface on the first night, while swimming to the raft. Blue, stationary, reaching down into the depth. Not phosphorescence, a something steadier, something different. She never explained what it was. Investigators working the Velasco case were never able to answer to questions. Why the captain had left the girl alive rather than killing her with the others. And how the raft had drifted to precisely the position where the cargo ship's course would intersect it, a route that appeared on no standard charts for small vessels in that area. When asked about these things, Lisa would smile. "The ocean took almost everything," she would say. "But it didn't take me." She never added anything more. She teaches swimming to children at a school near the coast now. Every morning she is the first one into the water, unhurried, without hesitation, like someone who settled a long and complicated debt with the sea years ago and has nothing left to prove. The questions remain. People still argue about whether her survival was chance or something the ocean chose. Lisa doesn't argue. She just swims.